I'm Arnold Key, and thank you for joining me. Hugh Price is a luminary of civil rights whose flame continues to burn brightly. Perhaps his most prominent role was as the president of the National Urban League from 1994 to 2002. The National Urban League was founded in 1910 and is considered one of the big five of original civil rights organizations, along with the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Conference on Racial Equality, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I reached out to Mr. Price specifically because of his advocacy for African American achievement. While heading the National Urban League, he launched a campaign that spread the gospel of achievement through parental involvement in education. Beyond that, he is the author of 5 books, including Strugglers into Strivers, What the Military Can Teach Us About How Young People Learn and Grow, Mobilizing the Community to Help Young Students Succeed, and Destination, the American Dream. But our interview is drawn primarily from 2 other books, This African American Life, and most notably, Achievement Matters, Getting the Best Education for Your Child. I strongly recommend those 2 books, along with the others. Please join us as Mr. Price shares how his family heritage, a presidential call to action, and an unfinished civil rights agenda, or to use his shorthand, DNA, JFK, and LBJ, sent him trailblazing towards educational excellence. All right, so after taking a couple of weeks of a break, I'm back at it. And today I'm really happy to introduce to you, or I'm saying introduce, but many of you probably already know Hugh Price. He was a former head of the National Urban League and has been a voice for achievement and for civil rights for quite a while. So today we're going to be talking a bit about his life and to some extent some of the themes that should be repeated out of the excellent book that he wrote, Achievement Matters. So I should say that my wife and I spent a lot of time particularly in Achievement Matters. And as I was looking at our copy, I could see the portions of it that she had underlined and the things that she had circled. There are still Post-it notes on our copy of the book.
Wow.
Yeah, so we definitely benefited greatly from that. Some of these things are things that my mom did with me as well, without actually even knowing that there were things that should have been written about.
Right. We call that mother wit, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so what do you think led to, or gave you that kind of spark to pursue achievement, not only in your own life, but also on behalf of others? So, there were a lot of things that you pointed to there, but share if you could some of what you think sparked that.
I jokingly say that DNA, JFK, and LBJ made me do it.
Okay.
And the DNA, I typically have thought about my mother's role as an activist when I was growing up in Washington, D.C. She was very involved in the efforts to desegregate the Washington schools and get the right for everybody to vote in D.C. When I grew up in D.C., we could not vote for anybody, including a mayor or a president.
Wow.
But actually the DNA reaches back farther than that, because her grandfather, who was my great-great-grandfather, was a very famous fugitive slave, along with his wife, Rebecca. This is George Latimer. George and Rebecca Latimer escaped from Norfolk, Virginia in 1842, and they went north to Boston. And almost as soon as they got there, a former employee of his slave master spotted him, and they had him apprehended. And there ensued one of the first major fugitive slave cases, where people like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison rallied to his side, along with other abolitionists in Boston, to actually free him. They bought out the slave owner, and he was set free. But right after he was set free, George became an activist on behalf of anti-slavery. And he joined Frederick Douglass in a lot of rallies. He was a folk hero for abolitionists. He was called Latimer the Lion. And he joined in collecting signatures for a successful petition for something which some people call the Latimer Law, which is basically a law in Massachusetts which forbade public officials to assist in the recapture and return of slaves.
Wow.
So instead of sort of going off to live on his own after he was freed, although he did that later, he became very involved in the abolitionist cause. And so I think that's where the DNA starts, to the best of my knowledge. And then, of course, my mother, who was his granddaughter, was very, very active. Then the JFK part is that when I was a sophomore at Amherst in 1961, right after JFK was elected, and then I heard his inaugural address. And in that famous address, he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country."
Yes.
And that struck my generation very, very deeply. Mm-hmm. In my senior year at Amherst, the summer after I graduated, I participated in the March on Washington. I was a volunteer marshal for the march.
Okay.
But then a couple of years after that, when I was in law school, LBJ, who had succeeded Kennedy after the assassination, delivered a speech in which he declared that we will end poverty in our lifetimes, and he launched a war on poverty. And so I said, where can I sign up? Mm-hmm. What can I do? So those are probably the three formative factors. And that's why I say it was DNA, JFK, and LBJ that set me on the course. I basically, with only a detour or two, have been on that path ever since.
That's amazing. And what occurs to me as well is that you also represent a part of the continuum, the civil rights continuum. So I'm young enough to have met many of the prominent, or several of the prominent civil rights leaders. So, for example, when I joined the Metropolitan Baptist Church in DC, and the day that I joined, Reverend Jesse Jackson was preaching that day. So, that's just one. In places that I've met, I've met, I don't want to just name drop, but I've met a lot of the other people that we know to be civil rights leaders back then. But you were working alongside them. You were there, you were connected in a way that, for me, sort of the outside looking in, and having opportunities to meet, but you've had a chance to really connect with many of the people that we would consider the civil rights leaders.
Well, let me step back just a generation from that to say I was blessed to grow up in a neighborhood. I mean, it's a Black neighborhood, but it was on the periphery of Howard University. And many of my neighbors, we lived at New Hampshire Avenue and Park Road, Northwest. Okay. It's basically a segregated neighborhood. It was white on the other side of 14th Street. But many of my neighbors, my parents' dear friends, and in some cases relatives, were what I call the first integrators. In other words, these were people who were born between 25 and 45 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And they were the people who, my future wife's uncle was the first Black man to get a PhD in anthropology. Our neighbor across the street was the first Black person to get board certified in pediatrics. My father's first cousin was the first Black person to get board certified in urology. My dad was the second. Right down the street, Charles Hamilton Houston, another illustrious Amherst alumni, lived right down the street from us, and my parents knew him and supported his civil rights litigation. Todd Duncan, who was the first man to perform Porgy and Bess, play Porgy, lived down the street from us. Sam Lacey, the crusading journalist who fought for the integration of Major League Baseball, lived a block away from us. Wow. And many of these people were products of the Dunbar High School back in the day. And many of them were graduates of Howard or affiliated with Howard. Another dear family friend was Dr. Charles Drew. And my brother's been married to his wife for over 60 years. Married to his eldest daughter, Bibi, for over 60 years. So this was the village. Right. These were the people who were breaking down the first set of barriers in many, many fields in this country. And I grew up with those people as family friends. And I knew what they'd done. I didn't know them well. They knew of me, but mainly I knew they knew my parents. And so I knew what they had accomplished. And for us, that was in many respects, the breakthrough generation. And then I was blessed as you say, years later, as I came into my prime professionally, to know and work with Jesse Jackson and Clifton Wharton, first African American to run a Fortune 500 company, Franklin Thomas, Vernon Jordan, John Jacob, Whitney Young, met all those people as when I was a young professional, and Charles Bannerman, who was head of a major community development corporation in Mississippi, and many others. And I said, I want to be like them.
Yes.
These are brilliant class acts, deeply committed to the progress of our people. And I mean, I could never orate like Jesse, but it was his passion and drive, and others had this passion and drive to improve conditions for our folks. And so, and then there are people who are well known in their fields of education. Dr. James Comer, I consider myself a protege of his. So I was blessed to have deep contact with these folks, to observe them in action, to learn from them, and to be inspired by them. So that was all part of my tutorial as a young professional, watching these folks in action and what they accomplished, and learning from what they learned.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much to be said about how that, when you're surrounded by that kind of success and those kinds of standards for achievement, how that can inspire. And so, much has been said about how, the upside of integration was that it provided us the opportunity to live in other places and attend other schools, but that the downside is that, that our the examples for younger people were now more diffuse, because people didn't necessarily belong to the same church anymore, or were, within earshot or within, around them. And, what is your take on that?
Well, I would simply say I grew up in rigid segregation in Washington, D.C. I wouldn't go back to it for a second. There was a fence around us that constrained our aspirations and our dreams.
Yes.
And the whole point of that generation of first integrators that I grew up with as my parents' friends was to break down those barriers. And if you saw those barriers in front of you, you went through them, around them, tunneled underneath them, circumnavigated them, but was to get to the other side of opportunity.
Right.
We live in a vastly different world now, and our folks have vastly different opportunities than we ever had under segregation. So we should have no illusions about that. But there are things that were lost. And I think what's interesting is that not that many years ago, probably a generation ago, there were questions about whether the Black fraternities and sororities and civic and social clubs and Jacks and Jills of the world relevant. They haven't gone anywhere.
Right.
They're stronger than they've ever been.
Yes.
So they're relevant in a different context now. So we need these organizations, we need these associations, we need these role models, we need people from whom we can learn, and we need organizations that have muscle and can move the agenda forward, and that can sustain us during difficult times like those that we're in right now. But I wouldn't go for a second, I wouldn't go back to segregation. No way.
Yeah, that's a good point that you make, that perhaps the way to look at it is that it's those social organizations that have retained those spaces where younger students can be surrounded by professionals in the way that segregation sort of I guess created based upon the social constraint. So moving forward,
let's just think about Amherst for a second. I think Amherst proudly announced that something like 30 or 40% of its incoming freshman class are young people of color.
Yes.
There were 5 Black students in my class when we entered. 3 of us finished. Not going back there.
Right.
And that was about the same number that was there in the 1930s.
Wow.
And 40s. So we should continue to push forward into the mainstream to attain our rightful place based on our drive and energy and what we have to offer, and based on fundamental notions of equality. We should never go back.
I agree. So, another thing that occurs to me is in 2022, if it feels different, sort of the atmosphere feels different, where, the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, there were more sort of prominent leaders out there who were laying a standard, or who will look to provide sort of a national voice representing our views. Where today it feels a little quieter. I feel that there are definitely leaders who are like community-based leaders, or you have the leaders of, let's say, the Black Lives Matter movement. But it seems like we've moved, and I'm not saying that this is a good thing or bad thing, but it seems like we've sort of moved away from this, like a singular leader, or like a set of people that will be looked to. Like, you remember when Tavis Smiley used to do the State of Black America, so those kinds of forums where so we gather the leaders together to share wisdom.
Tavis used to do a knockoff. The State of Black America is the trademark name of the annual State of Black America report issued by the National Urban League.
Yes.
Tavis did a television show which looked at those questions, but it's the National Urban League,
yes,
starting with Vernon Jordan, who launched
yes.
the State of Black America. But to your main point, I think it's important to realize that in the pre-social media era, there were a few newspapers, there were 4 television channels, so it wasn't hard to find those who are in the forefront because there are a limited number of places where you could find them.
Right.
Now, the leadership appears to be dispersed because our access to them is so much more vast. That doesn't mean there's any less talent out there. I never cease to be awestruck by the brilliant young people I see on television, on the MSNBCs and CNNs of the world. I don't watch Fox, and I don't follow social media, but I know there's tremendous talent out there. So it's a different world. When I was heading the National Urban League, we got very good coverage. I was blessed because the speech you read about in my memoir generated a tremendous amount of coverage, and I kind of got spoiled and figured that that's the way it's going to be for the rest of my tenure. But you find that you become familiar, and the media is often looking for an edge, looking for the outrageous, looking for the new. And I had editors of major national newspapers tell us, if you're not saying something outrageous, we're not interested.
Yeah.
So you say, okay. Oh, that's the way it is. Oh, okay. So that's what, and I've talked with contemporary leaders about that. So that's what they're swimming upstream against. But I would say this, there are movements that galvanize the national attention, and they are led in different ways. They use different techniques. They're very, very powerful. Black Lives Matter had a powerful impact, although the jury is out not on them, but out on America, on how we're going to respond to what they were about in terms of the police shootings and brutality and that kind of thing. And then you've got people like Stacey Abrams, who are amazing galvanizing leaders. Reverend James Barber, amazing, brilliant galvanizing leader. Doesn't have a national, well, he's got a national organization, but it's not one of the ones that we've known over the years, but it's powerful. So leadership and organizations evolve. Some of them stay the course, like the National Urban League and the NAACP, and evolve with the times, and others get formed in the urgency of now and make tremendous contributions. Some of them continue to exist and evolve, and some of them peter out, their mission accomplished, and they pass the baton. So that's in the nature of it. But we're dealing with stuff out there that's so much more diffuse now. And 3 years ago it's the police. Now it's critical race theory and the assault on teaching. So new entities have to arise sometimes to fight new issues in new ways, in new venues. And hopefully and it won't always be Black leaders. I mean, just last night I saw a remarkable speech by a white, straight, married Christian legislator in Michigan who went off on one of her ultra-conservative colleagues who had accused her of this, that, and the other thing. It is an amazing, amazing speech. So the issues we care about don't always have to be led by us. They have to be led by people with a heart and the right direction.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. I'll note too that I know that the National Urban League under Mark Morial just released the most recent State of
Right.
Black America
Right.
report, which I read sort of in
Right.
preparation for today.
Right. Right.
So I wanted to ask that question about leadership and the connection, because I was thinking also about the campaign for African American achievement
Right.
that you led, and just thinking about what today is like and the issues that we're looking at today, and whether you feel that there's space to revive that again, given the other issues that we're dealing with. But could you say, let's first talk about what that campaign was about, and how you got it initiated, and what you thought the
Right.
results were?
The impetus from the campaign was the fact that the American economy is evolving. We all know it's increasingly becoming a knowledge economy. So young people have to have higher and higher levels of education today in order to do the overwhelming majority of jobs that are available today. So not achieving, not learning, not doing well in school is not an option. And I remember this crystallized for me when I was taking the office as president of the National Urban League, when I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about a young student at a high school in Washington, D.C., who was an honor student and was due to be recognized at the graduation ceremony, but he was so intimidated by his peers who were not into achievement that I think he hid out in the lunchroom rather than appear, rather than go to the awards ceremony to get his award. And I remember thinking, we can't have that. We can't have that. No. So we launched the campaign to spread the gospel of achievement, and to do it in several ways. We wanted parents to be up to speed on what it is their children need to do and be able and accomplish in school. And that doesn't mean they have to know all the curriculum, but they've got to be deeply committed, monitoring what the schools are doing, collaborating with the educators, and keeping an eye on how their children are progressing and knowing how they can fit in. And the second thing is we wanted to celebrate achievement. We wanted to celebrate kids who were doing well in school. And one of our National Urban League trustees, Israel Tribble, had started a marvelous program in Florida called the McKnight Achiever Society, where they recognize all the Black kids in a local school district who had earned B averages or better in school.
Okay.
So we have the Honor Society basically for the A students, and that's great. But it's also the B students who are striving, who also need encouragement. So we asked for his permission to take his concept national, and we created the National Achiever Society. And we had ceremonies all over the country where Black kids who had earned B averages or better in school were inducted into the National Achiever Society local chapter in a very solemn induction, where they read an oath, they received gowns. Except they didn't receive gowns, they received designer jackets designed by Carl Kanai, who was a major development designer back then. And it was amazing. I remember being at Bayview Baptist Church in San Diego, and they inducted 250 Black kids into the National Achiever Society, all of whom had earned B averages or better, and half of whom were boys.
Right.
And there were over 1,000 people in the church.
Wow.
So many people that they had to sit in the pews set aside for the choir up in the front of the church.
See, that's awesome.
So we know that we were able to get to the children with this message that achievement matters. And there were evaluations of our achievement campaign where kids acknowledged that we had impacted their thinking about academic achievement. And I'll never forget some of the kids saying, in effect, to us as adults, "What took you so long to find me? What took you so long to wrap your arms around me and celebrate me?" So on a scale of 1 to 10, I think we hit about a 5. It didn't accomplish all that we wanted it to accomplish, but when it was cooking, it made a difference. And we got to the children, and that is verified by the result. Now, we have large scale issues. The numbers on how our children are doing in school have not really budged all that much. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's got to be a major investment in social and emotional and academic development of kids. I think schools have got to shed some of the constraints of all these standards and rigid tests, and they've got to encourage young people to learn and discover and grow. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us in unleashing the talent, potential, and interest of young people. So that's the work in front of us. I will say that I think the growing interest, I'm not a charter school person, but the growing interest of parents in alternatives is a sign that more and more parents are thinking about how the kids are doing and searching for answers. And also there are a lot of different kinds of small public schools and many school districts. So we've got a long way to go. And part of the problem is that public school systems have been besieged with reforms. Let's do this one for a couple of years and then do that one, and then tear up the schools and put them back together again, and impose this and do that. And they're kind of, the schools have been in a war zone in terms of public policy.
Right.
And they're not receiving the support they need. So we've got a lot of work to do. But the whole point of Achievement Matters is that there are things that parents can do, need to do, and if they can't figure out themselves and they belong to a church, get somebody in the church to help you. Get relatives to help you. Get people in mentoring programs to help. But don't let the kids just flounder, flop around in school. Get them motivated and support them and help point them in the right direction.
One of the things I really, really appreciate from the Achievement Matters book is the tone. I think that from my perspective, I've talked to parents over the years hearing, about these kinds of topics. But I guess maybe I'm just a little too kind in the way that I talk about things. Is what I tend to do is I'll say, well, this is what worked for us. Just knowing how defensive parents can be, about their children, because some parents look at how their children are doing, and I guess they should, as a reflection of them, right? In some cases, there are challenges that some children have with regard to learning and so forth, but I think that the tone that you take in the book, which is, we just can't afford to sit on the sidelines and let the school, do what they're doing without trying to, to involve ourselves in it.
Right.
And, especially since you give practical strategies. So if you wouldn't mind, just, talk about some of the strategies that people, I'm going to suggest that everybody read this book, but for the sake of conversation, some of the things that, that bubble up to the top when you think about the practical strategies that you think parents should be following.
Well, I think it starts with a parent realizing that she or he or the uncle or aunt who's involved and the grandparents involved is in many respects the child's first teacher, because children will spend the overwhelming majority of their time outside of school. So the tone that's set in the home, the tone that's set in the interactions with the children is critically important. How's school going? What are you doing in school? What are you expected to do in school? And then I think that parents have to make it clear to the educators that they perceive themselves as partners in the enterprise, not threats, but partners. And so parents want to know, what can I do to be supportive of what you're trying to get done here? What is it that my children are expected to do? Are they on course? What can I do at home? And if you're not really happy with what's going on, then you've got to raise a voice. One of my favorite examples was I forget her name now, I'm having a senior moment, but the Teresa Sanders, I think, who runs the Urban League in Long Island. And she went into her daughter, I think, was doing very well in school. And she went in to try to get her daughter put in the advanced placement classes or honors track. And the guidance counselor said, well, I don't have the paperwork for that, but I do have paperwork for placement in special education. And tell people it was all she could do not to hurt that guidance counselor. But she knew enough to know that was not the right course. Now, for some children, that is the right course, but it wasn't for her child.
Right.
So being clear about what you think your children's possibilities are, and then, being resolute about getting for them. Don't need to start any fights, don't need to get arrested or anything like that, but being resolute. I went in when our daughter wasn't placed where we felt she should be when we moved to New Rochelle. I went down to see the 9th grade teachers and just said, help me understand why she's not where we think she's supposed to be. And they said, well, she'll be very well served where we've placed her. And I said, far be it for me to question your judgment, but she's not in the right place. and then they also reveal something. They say, well, we only have a limited number of slots in the sort of most challenging courses, and we have but we have a gazillion more kids who want them. And I said, well, why don't you have a gazillion slots then?
Right.
If you've got that many kids who want the best that you can throw at them, make it available to them. Just don't limit it to the few. Well, we didn't get anywhere. And I told people, having a Black father, you know this, having a Black father show up in school is a big event.
Right.
I tell people I went down the closet, put my attitude on, and went over to the school. Right. But I had just met the superintendent a week before, and I said, well, I'm going to call the superintendent tomorrow morning. We'll get this straightened out. And before I could place the call, it got straightened out. So sometimes you just have to say, I know what makes sense, and I'm not settling for what doesn't make sense. But there are battles over, we have this thing about limiting access to really good education to a finite number of people based on a test, when there are many multiples of those children who can handle the work, want the work, and yet we husband it for the few. And when we have these fights over increasing access, those almost are like World War III fights in public education, because I've come to the view that if you make the best available to too many young people, then it's not best enough in the eyes of some people.
Right.
You know?
Yes.
You got to break through that.
Right. It's this idea that somehow what makes it good is the fact that some people can't get it.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Well, it is, yeah. So, but that's a fight they're having that in New York City in the schools, around the selective high schools. They have that around the gifted and talented programs. But, you know, there are many multiples of the kids who can handle much more challenging work, but we just don't make it available to them. And that's one of the scandals in public education, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and it's the way that it's discussed, conundrums are presented as opposed to solutions. So, for example, the idea that you necessarily are separating kids if some kids are in gifted education and some kids are not. That's something that's played out in Prince George's County, where my kids started off. And so, because there's a lottery, well, one, because there's a lottery system, and to your point about gifted education being somewhat limited. Now, when I was there and we were in the schools, I was part of, they had an organization called PG Tag, which was parents who had children in talented and gifted programs. And so in that capacity, I was able to connect with a lot of the other school officials. And they were very, there wasn't a lot of contention in terms of trying to make sure that whatever was made available, that it was the most fair process possible. But the overarching issue of the mere fact that there was a lottery was something that there wasn't enough momentum during that time to break. And so I appreciate you speaking to that. And I'm curious to know how many parents in Prince George's County right now are wanting their children to be in a certain program, but haven't gotten to that point yet. I think you speak to that very well.
The question is, why doesn't the school district provide much more of the good stuff? Right. The quality education. I mean, it's a fascinating issue that I've looked at from several perspectives. I used to be on the board of the Educational Testing Service, which is responsible for the SAT. Mm-hmm. And we used to press them on, because the colleges and universities relying so heavily on the SAT and the cut points on the SAT to determine who's in and who they should not pay attention to. And we would say, does a cut point tell you whether or not a kid just below the cut point is going to be able to handle the work at tough? Mm-hmm. Well, no. Then why is the cut point there? And it's like that we have 5 hyper-competitive high schools in New York City. And there's a test and there's a cut point. If you don't get above the cut point, you don't get in. Does that tell you that kids who are the next 500 kids who are below the cut point can't handle the work in that school? No, it doesn't tell you that. Then what are you doing? Right. And if okay, well, why don't you have 10 more of these high schools? Why don't you have 20 more of these high schools? I never forget when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, I visited a program we supported out in LA in one of the public high schools in, I think it was in Crenshaw or Watts or someplace. And by then it was overwhelmingly Latino. And I was taken to a wonderful class where largely low income Latino children were debating Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, the great philosophers, and writing papers about them.
Mhm.
And after the class, I was taken on a tour of the school, and I said, well, golly gee, I guess you got these kinds of classes all over the building. Well, actually, no, this is the only one because, scheduling problems and this and that. I said, okay, I got the picture. And
Yeah.
that's the stuff that goes on everywhere. We use the tests to exclude, we use the cut points, but the key question is who can handle the work, who wants the work, who wants to strive to grow and excel. And why don't we gear the schools to make those opportunities available to everybody who wants them,
Right.
as opposed to screening kids out. And that's one of the great battles in public education right now.
Yeah. And that screening out, if it takes place early, then it'll as you've written about, it'll continue. So if you exclude children from high quality early childhood development, then you've already baked into their development the inability to really compete at higher levels as they get older.
Right. Well, one of the areas of education that gets a lot of currency these days is STEAM education: science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been studies which have shown that in many school systems, children from low-income and minority communities who attend public schools do not have access in elementary school to the pre-STEAM courses. Mm-hmm. And you and I know if you don't get that, then when you hit those courses in junior high school, you're just out of luck.
Right.
And if you're out of luck, then you're going to be more out of luck in high school and college. So the disproportionate and disparate access based on income and race to that kind of education kicks in STEAM very early, very early. And to the extent that affluent parents they don't let their kids go to schools where you don't have access to that. And then they make sure through supplemental education programs and tutorials that they get it. So this stuff is pervasive and it's got to be fought at every level. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes the explanations, when you listen to them, you say, no. I understand what's going on here. That's what parents have to become very sophisticated about. Mm-hmm. And if they can't handle it themselves, they should try to find an aunt or an uncle or church member who can break it down for them and advocate for the children.
Right. This has been excellent. Before we wrap up, it's 45 minutes. It's already gone by, and I know you have to go soon. But I wanted you to share some of what you're working on now. We've talked about your great uncle.
My great granduncle, yeah, same.
Great granduncle.
Yeah, my great granduncle was Lewis Latimer, renowned inventor. In 1880, Thomas Edison got a patent for the first light bulb in the United States, but his light bulb burned out pretty quickly, and Latimer invented a carbon filament, which enabled the incandescent light bulb to burn longer and be more durable and more affordable. And he did a number of other things that were quite remarkable as well. So his former home in Queens, New York, Flushing, Queens, is now the Lewis Latimer House Museum. And I'm on the board, and we're gearing up for his 175th anniversary. He has not gotten his due in history circles. There have been documentaries about him on television and biographies of people like Edison and Alexander Graham Bell, who he worked with as well. They made no mention of him. So we're trying to do everything we can to make Lewis Latimer a household name. Jennifer Beals, the actress who performs in Showtime, the Showtime series called the L Word, once said of Lewis Latimer, I think of Lewis Latimer every time I turn on a light switch. So that's where we're trying to go. Right. Make everybody not just think about him, but thank him for what he did. He was also, amazingly enough, he was a real Renaissance man. He was a poet, painter, musician, and he not only invented important things like the precursor to the air conditioner, but he also supervised the installation of electric lighting in train stations and on streets, not just in the United States, but in Montreal. He ran a light bulb plant in London.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
he was climbing the corporate ladder while he was working for these lighting companies and also breaking glass ceilings as he went along. A remarkable man. And he was the son of George and Rebecca Latimer, the fugitive slaves I mentioned. And
Mhm.
his eldest sister, who Rebecca Latimer was pregnant with when they escaped, was my great grandmother.
Wow.
Uh, so this is kind of family business. Uh, his granddaughter, Louis Latimer's granddaughter, Winifred Latimer Norman, tried for many years to get me involved with the Latimer House Museum, but I was on the make professionally. I was traveling everywhere, and I said, "Oh, Winnie, I can't do it now. I can't do it now." And I was approached a couple of years ago. I'd run out of excuses.
Right.
So it's loads of fun, and we're on a really great roll.
That's awesome. Well, I will commit to doing another piece on Mr. Latimer as a way
Great.
of honoring him and in appreciation for you sharing time with us. And then also the grander point that you're making about the fact that he hasn't gotten his due. And, he does represent, achievement in the greatest sense because of what he's, contributed to society. So I will definitely do that. And
He gave a speech in 1880 in which to the Bridgeport Scientific Society, in which he said, "Art and science are inextricably linked. They're
interesting.
deeply interrelated." And when you think today about automobile design, Apple products,
Mhm.
ergonomics, as art and science.
Wow, that's
Oh,
awesome.
he saw that in 1880.
See that, and the fact that we didn't know that, to me, is another reason, to make sure that we honor his achievements
Right,
and his intelligence, what he
right,
brought to the world.
right.
So thank you so much. Um, all right,
He
well,
also he also
yeah,
wrote
yeah,
a poem
okay,
called Ebon Venus. It was an ode to his wife. It's all about Black beauty. It was the precursor for me to the Black is Beautiful movement in the 1960s.
interesting. Okay,
Ebon Venus. Check it out.
I will definitely check it out, and I'll find a way to weave it in, sort of post production,
Right.
to our interview. So, Hugh, it's been really great. I really appreciate all of your time. This is awesome. I can't wait to share with my friends this conversation.
Thank you.
Um,
My pleasure.
and so I wish you the best, and I will, stay in touch. Just see how you're doing,
Thank
because
you.
I feel that what I do from this point on will be an echo of all the achievements that you've done, that you've had, and all that you've put, in this book and the others that you've written.
Just
So
remember DNA, JFK, and LBJ.
awesome. Thanks again. I want to sincerely thank Mr. Price for his candor and leadership. Through his life and work, Mr. Price has boldly set a standard for how we should engage our children and promote excellence. He also makes it abundantly clear in his writing what he means by engagement: getting an early start on reading, helping children turn hobbies into learning experiences, visiting the school on parent-teacher nights and developing a working relationship with your child's teachers and school administrators, asking your children what's happening in class, or getting involved at the school district level if your children don't have access to challenging curricula. These are just 5 of the many suggestions found in his book, Achievement Matters. And while our intention in 2022 is focused on voting rights and criminal justice, educational excellence is still a part of the unfinished civil rights agenda. Yes, unequal funding and opportunity still present challenges that need system-level solutions, but there's so much we can do at home. Echoing Hugh's gospel, if we take charge of what we can influence, we can yet, as he put it, surmount obstacles and achieve success. Thank you for joining us.